These are a few words of introduction about our paper, Government Behind Insurance Governance, Lessons for Ransomware. And it all started off with Tom Baker and me participating and observing the meetings of the ransomware task force in 2020, 2021. And everyone felt that ransomware was in a state of crisis, a ransomware epidemic. And the final report of the ransomware task force addressed policymakers and made suggestions on 48 different government interventions that would help to get a grip on this ransomware epidemic. So both Tom and I work on insurance as governance. We're both fascinated by private order regimes. So we're kind of wondering here whether this hitherto very successful private governance regime had broken down, or whether what people presented to us as a crisis was just a market correction and perhaps a long overdue opportunity to innovate. So the question motivating our paper is, should governments rush in to help? And if so, where should they help? What should be the priorities? Are there any pitfalls to avoid? And the way we do this is to look at 6 mature insurance markets that also faced viability crises at some point in the past, just to see what we could learn about government, either implicitly or explicitly supporting insurance as governance.
So as Anja mentioned, we do a series of case studies, but we also make some conceptual points that we think are important. And the first and probably most important one is to remind people who think that we can rely on insurers to regulate risk and to manage risk, that governments stand behind insurers. And the second thing we do is to identify and categorize the kinds of government activities that may help make risks insurable. And there's really 3 that we identify. One is governments regulate risk. The second is that governments invest directly in risk reduction activities. And then the third thing that governments do is that they co-insure the risk. They will, in other words, make some payments when bad things happen.
One of the examples that we're looking at is kidnap for ransom insurance. And it looks like the poster child of private governance and a successful private governance regime. And it's one that has been formed over time and in response to crises that look very much like the current ransomware crisis. And at each of these crisis points, insurers created new protocols for prevention, new protocols for hostage crisis resolution, ways to reward cooperation and discourage damage. And they have also managed to really successfully stabilize kidnaps. But once we start looking at government presence in this market, we find that it's extremely important. And all the insurance contracts are crucially relying on duty of care, so that the insured can't cut corners on prevention measures, can't cut corners on how they run the negotiations. So on that regulation dimension, even though we don't have big government presence in terms of resources and regulation making, it's the duty of care that does a huge amount of work to keep this market very stable. Local and national governments are also involved in managing the threat at the local level, perhaps through law enforcement, perhaps through military presence. The more troubled and hostile and complex an environment is, the more governments might help manage the risk at that level and devote real resources to it. And finally, governments do intervene on the co-insurance dimension at the point when a kidnapping threat becomes so large that is considered a terrorist threat. And at that point, governments start paying ransoms. So even though we didn't really think of this as a government behind governance, insurance governance regime, once we look very carefully, we see a presence, but it's relatively low in terms of resources devoted on each of the three dimensions.
So another example of a case study that we present in the paper is environmental liability insurance market. And here, because without liability, there's no need for liability insurance, and without government, there's no liability. It's obvious that government is involved. But this is an area where we classify government involvement as high in the risk regulation level. We classify it as high on the risk reduction level because governments invest in reducing risk, for example, cleaning up waste sites. And then governments are also high in the co-insurance dimension because if a former landowner absconds or becomes unable to clean up a hazardous waste site, it becomes the government's problem. But we included the case study not only for comparison purposes, but also because it demonstrates how sometimes governments can inadvertently make risks uninsurable and how governments can respond. And so here, hazardous waste liability was so strict that no one was willing to insure many brownfields, which is a term for former hazardous waste sites that are located in urban population centers. And they wouldn't do that because the new owner or developer could end up being liable for the past problems. And so as a result, people wouldn't put those properties to use. Government addressed that problem by providing for a safe harbor that if a developer cooperated with the government and behaved in a proper manner in relation to the waste site, they wouldn't be liable for those past liabilities. Those safe harbors gave insurers the assurance that they needed to be able to provide insurance, and as a result, the brownfields have been developed.
Overall, we think that the current hard market is not so much a crisis, but a much needed spur and an opportunity to innovate and to take corrective action. Insurance as governance only works because insurers have skin in the game. And yes, if you start pinching, it will hurt. And it should hurt at least enough so that the adjustment process is set in motion. So we don't think this is a time where governments should ride to the rescue on all dimensions. However, we do find that the cyber insurance market is so big and so diverse that the industry will find it really difficult to find consensus and take collective action without some government help. So overall, limited government intervention is and will continue to be necessary and beneficial in this market.